Messieurs les présidents, Mesdames, Messieurs,
Ladies and gentlemen, the chairman, ladies and gentlemen, the directors, dear colleagues, I'd like to invite you to use the interpretation service to follow my introductory remarks in French, and I'll move into French in English for moderation purposes. And we're in Paris. I'm a minister of the government of Paris. I'm offering a few moments in French, as it were. I'm delighted to moderate this high-level seminar on speeding up the coal transition process towards clean energy within the framework of the Paris Peace Framework. I'm moderating this discussion at the request of the French President because we're just 1 month away from the opening up of the COP28, and it's quite clear that our collective efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions are not going quickly enough. Now, at the current pace, we will not abide by the limits of 1.5 degrees, and the first source of emissions, you are well aware, is coal. And so exiting coal is not going quickly enough. Coal today remains the first source of electricity generation in the world, and around 500 gigawatts of coal projects. Just now, to give you an idea, we're talking about 4 times the total of the production electricity generation capacities of all other energy forms mixed together of a country like France. 500 gigawatts, undeniably a climate bomb waiting to go off. Now, there are solutions out there, and these coal power generation systems exist, but our intention today is explore potential avenues to accelerate the exit out of coal, and we want to prepare a large event at the COP28 with the President of the Republic, with John Kerry and other top leaders of the northern and southern hemispheres to speed up the exit out of coal. And of course, we have to continue to encourage governments to review their economic development and climate development strategies to ensure they're compatible with the Paris Climate Agreement. And I know I'd like to put the PPC and the members of this is increasing swell. If all too frequently coal seems to be like being the most economic powerful system, it's because there's a market flaw is not being fully taken into account. The negative externalities, which are not only impinge adversely upon our planet, but also the health of our citizens. With coal, we're talking tens of thousands of premature deaths across the world. I'd like to call upon the political courage, and as well as providing financial and economic incentives, and this has to be done, as we understand, in several ways. Firstly, drying up the private funding for coal mines and carbon power generation centres. Now, there's work being done in the OECD and the G7, but not enough until now in drying up private sources of funding. But today, the carbon energy production system is still supported by private companies, fund managers, and we have to go beyond the voluntary commitments, and we have to create a common framework for restricting private sector funding for coal. Now, the second avenue worth exploring, we need the World Bank and the multilateral, the development banks to handle to direct the funding for coal to more renewable energy forms, and the handling of these failed assets, or we hope that these deal with these failed assets of the energy system. Around the table, Mr. Yves Perrier, who is the president of Rothschild, the president of Honor Amundi, and the Institute of Sustainable Finance. We also have Mr. Dean Nikou, who is the chairman of the Asian Investment Bank in Infrastructure. Madam Udi Ronamusso, who's just arrived and who's president of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And you can see that it's been raining outside in Paris. And Assis Sami, who is the director of the Sustainable Development of the Bank Société Générale. As we have 45 minutes today, I'd like to ask each speaker to limit themselves to an intervention duration of 3 minutes because we've got some very high-quality speakers in the public today, within the audience that I'm called upon today.
Let me first turn to Yves Perrier, President of the French Institute for Sustainable Finance. In 2019, French financial companies committed to stop financing coal in OECD countries by 2030 and to stop financing coal in non-OECD countries by 2040. How do you view this commitment in light of current global warming and the ongoing deployment of new coal capacities, particularly in non-OECD countries?
Thank you, Madame la Ministre. So I speak English. You have mentioned the fact that we are late in the trajectory in order to meet the objective of 2050. And clearly the question of carbon coal is the key question, because presently it represents 27% of the global primary energy in the world and 36% of electricity in the world is coming from coal. It's the case in countries like China, India, and as you know, the main battlefield, in fact, to be successful in this transformation, which is an industrial transformation, will be in all these countries, in fact, to be able to have economic development, to continue the economy, and to stop the use of fossil energy and especially for coal. You mentioned that in Paris we have been quite pioneer in this topic. In 2019 we issued a declaration in which we made strong commitments to fight climate change and contribute to the goal of carbon neutrality by 2050. We committed as well to working with our stakeholders to adopt a coal strategy with a comprehensive disengagement timeline and to report on it on their regular non-financial reporting. And we have created an observatoire of sustainable finance, which gives transparency on this. Today, we have obtained tangible results. 100% of French banks and insurers and asset managers have coal exclusion policies. Also, if we look at the French financial institution, the coal has reached historically low levels. For example, the financing of coal represents 0.02% of the balance sheet of French banks. That means 2 billion euros only. It's too much, but you see that it's very low. And we are also members of all the alliance. And so we support the initiative, but now we have to work also with investment in order to give the possibility to all these countries using coal to replace it by other sources of energies. And this will require to be innovative, to mix public and private money, because I know that the public institutions are committed to this, but it's very important that private money come in order to finance this investment.
I'm just expecting for the end of the translation. Okay. I would now like to turn to Jin Kun, President of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Development banks have a key role to play in managing to exit from coal. The role of the AIIB is central in this regard, as we know most of the new planned capacity of coal plants lie in Asia. What role can your bank play in providing alternatives to coal-fired generation and supporting the coal phase-out in Asia?
Thank you very much. There are three important issues we need to consider. First, a phasing out of financial support for coal expansion. This is the financial support. Secondly, is phasing out of existing coal use. The third is ramping up renewable energy investments. In the three areas, we, as a multilateral development bank, particularly a new bank created in the 21st century, is to contribute to the transition to net zero. And our mission is to accelerate the whole process. Now, with regard to the first issue, phasing out of financial support for coal expansion, we are 8 years into operation. We have never, ever financed any coal project. Not just the coal-firing power plants. We do not finance any project which is functionally related to coal. I'll give you one example. We turned down some of the project proposals, which is to build a transmission line which will be linked to the coal power plant. We said no. So we never done that. And the newly updated energy strategy takes out coal at all. Even though we have never done that, but it's in terms of the strategy policy, it's clearly out. Secondly, how to help these member countries phasing out of existing coal use. I think in financial terms or economic terms, probably if you build a coal power plant, the life cycle mostly would be at 30 years or something. So if you build it, it could be stranded assets, considering possible technical breakthroughs anytime soon. So it makes a lot of sense for us to phase out the existing coal-firing power plants. But how to do this? We need to make sure that developing countries' people would not be cut out of the power supply. That would create a huge backlash, because if you do not provide affordable energy to people, I think the backlash would be huge. And you will lose the support of the people for the transition to net zero. This applies to developing countries as well as to developed countries. That's a very critical issue. So my idea is that we need to ramping up our efforts to develop renewables. Now, if you have sufficient renewable power to replace existing coal-firing power supply, then you will not create a kind of situation that people would be faced with power outage, blackout, brownout, and you would win more support from the general public. So we would like to work with the World Bank, EBRD, Odile here, and other development banks, try to put more resources in renewables, accelerating the building up of the clean energy so that you phase out the coal. Now, I want to tell you that updated energy strategy does not rule out gas. So some people said you should not even finance gas projects. We understand the concern, but we do not simply support a gas project. We won't do that unless this gas project would be clearly and equivocally replace the coal power plant. And only under that kind of conditionality would it be possible to consider. Give you one example. In one of the Asian countries, they proposed a gas project for us because the power demand is increasing very high. But we thought, just because there's no clear linkage with the phasing out of a particular coal power plant, we turned it down. So it's, it calls for lots of courage. Sometimes I feel a little bit painful because I know the power supply is important, but what should we do? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So you mentioned Odile Renaud-Besseau. I will now give the floor to the president of the EBRD. Following the attack on Ukraine and the spike in gas prices, several countries have switched some of their gas electricity production to coal. What role can the EBRD play in decommissioning existing coal assets to transition towards renewable investments?
Thank you very much, and a pleasure to be here. I will start first by a sort of economic diagnosis, which is, I believe really that coal is uneconomic when you take into account all the externalities. So when you carbon price, impact on health, and so forth, coal is not cheap. When it's often presented as cheap, but it's not true when you take into account all the elements. But however, it's quite difficult to get rid of coal because you have some energy security issue, job issues, a lot of people working in the mining industries, vested interests and so forth. So we see challenges in getting rid of coal. But I fully agree with what was said, which is the first thing to do is not to finance coal. EBRD has stopped since 10 years ago to finance anything related to coal, including transport infrastructure, which are principally related to coal products, but also working with financial institutions. We work in different countries to help them, the banks, the institutional investors, to help them stopping financing coal with their clients also. And we work, as you mentioned, Ms. Agnes, we work in countries where coal is still very important. For example, Western Balkans, coal represents in many countries 70% of the energy source. So this is a big challenge to get out of it. I do agree with what Li Jinqing said, which is the first thing to do is to increase alternative source of energy and to finance renewables. So that's what we are doing very substantially. We still need to acknowledge that you need some investment to get out of coal for decommissioning, for example, for closing assets. It has some costs, so this may need to be financed, but we are not very supportive. There are some institutions or some reflection about buying out coal producer. We believe it's very costly and not necessarily the right way to do, but still there are some costs that public support needs to support in order to get rid of coal. And what we are doing with our clients, countries and private sector clients, is to develop incentive for them to get out of coal. For example, through products like sustainability-linked bonds, where we will finance them, bring some financing to develop for investment or for developing new source of energy, and attached with this financing will be very clear indicators on reducing coal. One big avenue, I think, in the coming years, what we need to do together with other institutions and with the private sector is to develop country strategy, not only look project by project and doing one renewable plant there and another one here, but really to have country strategy, what is called now country platform, focusing on what is the right policy overall to go to the net zero transition and decommission fossil fuel plants, develop renewable. And we are doing that, for example, in Egypt. I think this is a very good way to bring private sector, because then there is a clear plan, a long-term plan, where the countries commit to, in the case of Egypt, is to decommission a gas power plant and to develop renewable. And we got some soft money subsidies to finance the development of grid, and with this big renewable strategy, this is attractive for the private sector. We are trying to do the same in North Macedonia, and we hope to be able to announce that in COP. North Macedonia is a country which depends 40% for its energy on coal. And they have a commitment, they are willing to commit to decommission all coal source of energy by 2030. But this requires a lot of support, a lot of investment in renewable and so forth. So we are trying to work with them on a sort of policy package that then will bring together governments for funding, but also other MDBs and private sector in order to put in place this strategy, which I think is the best way forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me finally turn to Asina P., Chief Sustainability Officer in Société Générale. From a private sector perspective, beyond individual commitments from specific commitments, what are the challenges faced when trying to manage coal phase out? And what is the right approach from your point of view to dry up private finance to coal?
Right, thank you. Maybe I will surprise you, but I think we dried up quite a lot. I'm representing a French bank, but also I think the global private European banks, and probably some more. Let me explain. When we say that we are going to stop financing coal in OECD countries by 2030, and in the rest of the world 2040, in fact, back to COP28 in Paris, we stopped completely financing dedicated projects in coal. And what we say is that we are going to stop financing clients that still have some coal and no plan to exit by 2030 or 2040, depending on where they are. But we do not finance any coal expansion. Any development of coal is prohibited. So that's the first thing. Why did we get there? As first, NGOs were quite strong, I think, 10 years ago on all the banks. And then I think we had a friendly invitation by our government for COP21. And we all made a strong push at that time. And we said no more projects. And what I said, 2030, 2040. Now, on top of that, we all committed, all meaning 120 banks in the world, half of the banking assets, to reduce our carbon footprint in line with the 1.5 degree scenario. That means our CO2 footprint is watched, but more than that, we take commitments in intensity, for example, on the power portfolio. If I would like to finance coal today, the carbon intensity is 1 ton of CO2 per megawatt hour. But just to give you an idea, the net zero by 2030 already is 0.14. So it doesn't work, you see? And by 2040, by the way, the scenario, the 1.5 degree scenario is 0. So I can only finance renewable energy if I want to be in line. So that's the second pressure. There was the friendly one, the NGO, and then the CO2 footprint, and now the commitment on the decarbonation of the So in a way, if you want, coal is already a red line. But as a responsible bank, sometimes I wonder if it's a good thing, if I may. Why? Because, as you say rightly, there are parts of the world where coal is there, and that's a big part of the energy mix, so that's it. So now, if I want to work on the phasing out of coal, to come back to your question, my strategy, my policy, and many of my peers does not allow me to do so. Now, that's the fact. If I wanted to cooperate, because we have good partners here around this panel, I think, well, we would need to change. We would need to say with our authorities, supervisors, and NGOs. And, of course, as a commercial bank, we need to finance something that will provide cash flows. Phasing out is not something you can call as cash flow producing. So we would need to work on the monetization of this phase out, saying that if a coal power station is 40 years life, in Asia, the average is 10 years, so imagine. So we would need to say, okay, how much coal am I going to avoid for the global world? What is the value of it? And then who can pay for that in a way? And it has to be public or MDBs or philanthropy maybe, because it has a real value for the planet. But then what we see as well is that we can retrofit some utilities. So it's not only closure. They can go for the usage of low carbon fuel, or we can convert some of the utilities, and the workforce, of course, is there, for ancillary services. So there is something to work upon, but I have to say humbly, we have not, because this is the red line for us. On top of that, as you rightly said, we can only close coal or phase out in advance if we push for more renewable energy. Now, in many of these countries, you have to realize that most of the big banks like mine have worked on mega power stations. We know how to do a big project finance. But here we are talking mini-grids or small-scale assets, it's a different animal. So we need to see how to standardize, aggregate, work together. We need to reinvent it. We are happy to do that, but what we see, as you rightly say, it has to be a clear plan for a country, because we need capacity building. You know, we need a lot of contractual setup, and people need to be trained. It's a whole new world. So I think we're very willing. I'm talking about commercial banks, but we need to do that together. There has to be concessional money, and I'm sure we can find a lot of different ideas. But not to be too negative, regulators do not reckon for us, for the moment, the right risk weight capital usage for small-scale assets. It's easier for a big oil and gas project, by the way, than for a small renewable. But that's it. And also, as we are a European bank, if we finance small-scale renewable in emerging countries, we'll have difficulties to say this is in line with the European taxonomy, because we have social standards, we have do not harm, that sometimes we do not know how to prove that they are met, because you know, we don't have the same standards. So just to wrap up, coal is out. Maybe it's not a good idea. Maybe we should work on phase out with a lot of creativity, and we are open to do that. And for renewable energy, likewise, we need a bit of innovation there.
Thank you very much for the interventions from our distinguished speakers. I will now turn to the audience, where we also have very distinguished speakers whom I welcome to react, respecting the 3 minutes limit. Let us first hear from Alice Carr from the Glasgow Financial Alliance from Net Zero. This alliance is a global coalition of leading financial institutions committed to accelerating the decarbonization of the economy, and I look forward to hearing your reaction.
Thanks very much. And I hesitate to speak after Hasina, who did a very good job of articulating the situation for private finance. So the alliance mentioned is the Net Zero Banking Alliance that you're in. GFAN supports 8 subsector alliances that now convene more than 650 financial institutions that have all committed to net zero by 2050 in line with 1.5 on science-based pathways. Most credible science-based pathways leave very little space, and in fact no space for new coal. So all of the firms are thinking very hard about how to handle this, and as mentioned, many of them have set policies that exclude coal financing. But we're also conscious in the work that we do that growing green is important, but the time frame we have is very short. So we need to go where the emissions are and start trying to work to get them down, whether that's hard to abate sectors or dealing with assets that are going to strand, but we need to get them out of the system faster. And we've been trying to support the G7 JETPs in particular, and we've become very aware that EMDs, just as mentioned, have very young power plants. The contractual terms on those run for many decades from here. So unless we find a way to make it economic and create incentives to shorten those, it's very difficult to deal with. And we can't just say that they should cancel the contracts and so on, because that has wider ramifications. So we need some kind of transactional solution for these plants within a broader transition plan. And we completely agree that it's much easier to do this if you have a plan for a country, even if it's not perfect and you're kind of evolving it as you go along. If you can situate the assets within that plan, that's very helpful. So we think, we're trying to ramp up renewables too, but we think we need to sort of tackle head on how to do credible coal phase out transactions. And that will need greater agreement, I think, across governments in both advanced economies and emerging markets, across MDBs and DFIs, across private sector, and across technical experts such as the OECD and IEA, etc., on what credible looks like here. And I think we'd love to continue this conversation over coming months and no doubt years to start to make real progress on transactions. And as mentioned, we've asked our members to engage with coal phase out directly. And when we first asked, many said we don't want to. we're going to get into trouble for engaging with this topic. But now that they've started looking at how could you do coal phase out, some of them can see a path forward, but they can't take that path unless we're kind of agreed that this is a sensible thing to do. So I think we'd love to continue the conversation and see if we can accelerate phase out. Thanks.
Let me now turn to Mathilde Ménard from the OECD. Mathilde Ménard has a lot of experience both from the financial and environment perspective. Today the OECD has been mentioned several times, so my question is very straightforward. Do you think the OECD could work on setting up guidelines on private financing for coal?
Yes, so first let me fully agree with the idea of this initiative, because based on OECD and IEA analysis, it's pretty clear that phasing out coal is needed. It's not only needed, it's really necessary very urgently. And most importantly, more recently, we can show that it's possible based on the growth of renewable energy and its efficiency. So now it's getting really possible. And we do think at the OECD that we are well equipped to support the initiative if we were asked to do so. With the existing work that we have, work streams, on coal and broader fossil fuel phasing out, basically, and let me mention a couple of things. First, we have already standards that could be foundational in terms of, developing maybe some more specific ones. This includes, and I will mention only two, OECD guidance on transition finance that was developed last year, and that is arguing that the transition investments should be anchored in entity-wide corporate climate transition plans aligned with the Paris Agreement. And we have also our work on, the M&A guidelines on responsible business conduct that could be also foundational to develop a more specific standard on coal phasing out. We have also more recently developed very much in-depth analysis on mechanisms to prevent carbon locking in transition finance, and with a lot of recommendation to future-proof and retire early, high-emitting assets with many specific recommendations, so that could be a very good basis for developing a more specific guidance. And we are also working already with some very relevant partner countries, as we call them at the OECD. And let me mention one, for example, and we are working with them specifically on phasing out coal. And let me mention Indonesia, for example. And Indonesia, everything related to coal mining and related industries makes up almost 40% of the total state revenue and roughly 8% of GDP. So it's quite significant for them. And what we are doing currently with them is to develop guidelines and tools for transition finance in the context of facing down, not out perhaps, but facing down coal. And we have also another instrument that we have developed very recently, last year, framework for industry net zero transition. And we do think it's quite important also, because this framework, basically it's a step-by-step approach to assist countries, mostly emerging and developing countries, in improving enabling conditions, and it has been mentioned by several speakers, and identifying financing mechanisms to accelerate industrial carbonization. And we do think that this has been a little bit overlooked so far, this issue of industry decarbonization, because coal is a major input as well as an energy for some high emission intensive sectors like steel, cement, or chemicals. And the new industrial project, not the energy project per se, but the industrial projects are still highly relying on coal in some emerging and developing economies. So in this area also, we are already working very specifically in some countries in the context of their ZPs. So for example, with South Africa or Indonesia again, in terms of the sectors like steel or petrochemical. And so we have really both a basis in terms of existing standards and existing more like practical work with big emerging economies, specifically discussing how they could, what is needed in terms of all the enabling environment, the specific conditions, the financing mechanism, etc. So I think we could be very well equipped to help you there.
Well, thank you very much for the hand given. Let me now give the floor to Xavier Ploquin from Meridiam. Meridiam finances and develops renewable infrastructure in developing countries. How can international financial institutions bring solutions to de-risk such projects that in the end prevent the development of coal plants?
Thank you, Madame la Ministre. Yes, indeed, at Meridiam we are an infrastructure fund and we finance projects, in particular in Africa, that are all renewable because we completely exclude fossil fuel. But what we see is that it is very difficult to design projects that really contribute to phasing out fossil fuel and coal in particular. We contribute to reducing the consumption. We do PV, we do wind, we do hydropower, but we do not provide solutions that completely get rid of the coal. And this kind of project development is just too hard for most of the developers. It's something that takes time. We have, for instance, a biomass power plant. It took us more than 11 years to go to financial closing. So this is something that developers and funds cannot face. It is something that can be brought by big utilities, but it needs help. So what we would have said is that the first thing that we would require from the financial institution is long-term support and project preparation from the IFIs. And this is something that needs to be really designed because we have never seen any retrofit project, for instance, all across Africa. So today it just does not exist. So before we can finance it, we need to find them. I would just have closed here 1 year ago. Starting from now, I would add that there is a global liquidity or equity shortage. It's very much harder to raise funds and to find debt. The relative attractiveness of emerging market has gone down because the rates in Europe, for instance, have completely increased. So we will also need probably support to replace the risk point of those projects, either to protect from the risk or to enhance the return. But it's something that we will need support for. And also going into Asina's direction, we also now face sometimes difficulties from some of the developing financial institutions to label our projects as sustainable for European standards. And it should never happen when it comes to phasing out coal. So this is something that we really need to address now.
Thank you. The Powering Past Coal Alliance gathers 167 members, including 50 governments. It is co-chaired by the UK and Canada. Could I ask Theo Rycroft, UK Deputy Chief of Mission, to briefly present this initiative?
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Ministre. So I'm
very much, Madame Minister.
The UK and as one of the co-chairs of the Powering Past Coal Alliance, the world's first and only public-private initiative seeking to accelerate clean growth through the rapid phase out of coal power. As you mentioned, Madame la Ministre, since its launch in 2017, we have grown to more than 165 members, including national and subnational governments, private organizations, including 34 financial institutions with assets under management of over $17 trillion, including Amundi, who are here, of course, with us today. PPCA membership can be a key enabler for ending coal power, helping governments and financial institutions and utilities commit to coal phase-out dates. So we, as the Alliance, strongly support the initiative here today from France, including today's consideration of the challenges and opportunities that we've heard faced by the private sector and MDBs in taking action to phase out coal. But it is great to see so many reunited here today to have this discussion. 2 years ago at COP26, the world committed to accelerating the phase down of all unabated coal power. Yet, as you mentioned, Madame la Ministre, while the Glasgow Climate Pact was a historic achievement, this year's global stocktake requires us to go further. It clearly demonstrates that we're off track to meet our climate goals. But we do already have the solutions, so we must all come together at COP28 in a few weeks' time, ready to agree those actions needed to put us back on track, and coal must be first and fastest, because keeping 1.5 degrees alive requires immediately stopping the building of new coal power plants, scaling up clean power, and retiring existing coal fleets early, with the aim that in the Alliance we think by 2030 the OECD and EU should phase out coal by 2030 and 2040 for the rest of the world. Permit me to mention the UK, because in 2012 we had 40% of our electricity was produced by coal power, and in 2020 it was 2%, and this was a huge transition for us. But the private financial sector is, of course, critical to this transition, and we're really encouraged by the actions that our PPCA members are taking. Our financial institution members are all committed to the PPCA's financial principles, currently being refreshed, which translate no new coal and coal phase-out commitments into credible and impactful plans. So, while this accelerated action is vital, we believe that we should not simply divest from coal. We need proactive involvement and investment from both public and private sectors to phase out existing coal assets in a just way. We strongly welcome the work underway on the frameworks for managing the phase-out of coal, for example, from GFANS, as we've heard from Alice. And we encourage everyone here today to join us in our mission to phase out coal and to support the Coal Transition Accelerator initiative at COP28. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Let me now very briefly conclude. Today was the start, finally, let me turn to Warren Evans from the Asian Development Bank. So, yes, I was going straight to the point, because what role can the ADB play in managing the coal phase-out in Asia?
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to talk very quickly about the energy transition mechanism, which actually started before the JETPs were launched, and now really are an integral part of the JETPs, for example, in Indonesia. The energy transition mechanism is a combination of, it has three parts. The first part is decommissioning coal-fired power plants by combining concessional finance with commercial finance. And then by basically refinancing the power plants, we're able to, conceptually, to close them down 10 years earlier than they would have been. If we get a decent price on carbon, then we can cut another couple of years off of that. The second part is the just transition. So making sure that those who are affected by the decommissioning have the kinds of opportunities to not just survive, but actually have economic opportunities for development. And the third part is renewable energy, so replacing the coal-fired power with renewable energy. What we've learned, and this is based on a lot of very interesting feasibility studies and different analytical work, no surprise, every country is different. And so the scenario in Indonesia, which is where the first transaction will take place, we hoped it would be signed before the COP, but it's probably going to be the first quarter next year now. These are very complex agreements, and it is cumbersome at least. But the first deal will be in Indonesia. The second one will be in Philippines. The differences between those two countries in terms of the regulations and the ownership structure and so on is very substantial. So I think that the concept is solid, but it's very clear that before we engage in any transaction, it makes sense, and for ADB, we have what we call policy-based loans, to go in and actually help governments make the regulatory reforms required to enable them to do this. So it's a combination of both sovereign support for the policy and regulatory reform, followed by a public-private partnership for the decommissioning of the plants and the just transition and the renewable energy. Thank you.
So I will really conclude this time. Today was the start of an important conversation, and as I said in my introduction, we need to work together to accelerate coal phase-out. The key takeaways from this conversation that I see are that we need clear policies from multilateral development banks, not just on stopping coal-related financing, but also on how to support existing coal assets conversion to renewable and clean energy assets. Effective guideline from the OECD in order to create a level playing field from private financial institutions. De-risking policies to accelerate the deployment of renewables in emerging and developing countries. And finally, a coal transition coalition composed of representatives from BMD's international organization, and key actors could be set up to present proposals on those ideas. We have a lot of work to do, but we need to do that work because phasing coal is absolutely urgent, and at the same time, this will not work if it jeopardizes energy security and the local labor market. This is exactly what you mentioned. The next step will be COP28 in Dubai, with a leaders event on this same topic to keep progressing on this dynamic. So I hope we'll find the right ways and means to address this situation and offer good new solutions so that we could move forward quickly on that issue. Thank you very much to all.